Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Got a bit of a sort of newsy roundup kind of thing, talking about a couple of posts that were made over on Riot Scruffy's Twitter page, where they talked about a couple of recent news items that I did want to cover with you guys. First and foremost, because I did cover one of these in my video on Friday, where Riot published their numbers about the champions that were being hardbound to certain mythic items, and sort of how that was shaping up. Now, Riot, unfortunately, included data from their ARAM and ERF modes while they were pulling together that infographic and all of that information. So unfortunately, the numbers they gave us were not entirely accurate in that post. It was a complete mistake, and I can totally see somebody on the team making that sort of mistake, just pulling data from all games and not realizing that we really want to just look at Summoner's Rift, and especially ranked queues. They do actually separate out normals, so normals actually is a little bit higher than ranked queues. But either way, so looking at this, actually they said that 88% of the champions were hitting their mythic goal in 11.3, but the correct number for Summoner's Rift queues is 72%, 74% if you include normals. Now, this is a pretty decent drop. This is a 16% drop from the numbers that they did report, but 72% is still a huge upgrade over what they said before. I think before they said it was like 22% in Season 10, so definitely a big upgrade, regardless of the numbers being accurate or not. But there are some champions I wanted to talk about, go through this real quick and talk about the champions that were sort of added to the list after the fact, now that we've realized that they are pushing numbers. Now, nothing changed for the marksmen. Actually, there's just still the 380 carries that are pushing the envelope there. 80 assassins are interesting because Kha'Zix actually dropped below the hardbinding thresholds after they only looked at the Summoner's Rift queues. So Kha'Zix is actually doing okay. He's totally fine. So assassins are actually having a variety of options, and there's not necessarily one that's spamming Duskblade to the exclusion of all else. I did say it was kind of weird that Kha'Zix was exclusively spamming that one, but so that's essentially why Riot's sort of said, yeah, okay, we understand that that was a mistake, and now that we have the actual numbers, yeah, Kha'Zix is fine. But moving on to the AP Assassin and Fighters, there are a few champions here that are exceeding. Evelynn, Kennen, LeBlanc, and Nidalee were all added to the list. Now, none of these particularly surprise me. Kennen with the 81.4% rate on Hextech Rocket Belt totally makes sense. That was his core item on an AP builds, regardless in the older item system, so the fact that he's still building it today totally makes sense to me. Nidalee and Evelynn with Night Harvester, of course, because they're going to be the champions springing on you from Fog of War and trying to get as much upfront burst as they can. They don't really care about Luden's Tempest mana is the biggest thing, because I could see a champion like Evelynn especially, who needs the mobility, go with the Luden's Tempest, land the first Q on somebody, get the bonus damage, get the bonus movement speed to keep up with you and do the Q spam into the E, that kind of thing. Or going with the Rocket Belt in order to close the gap and actually get the first damage off to proc her W. So it does kind of surprise me that Evelynn is still hardbound to Night Harvester, but she's definitely lower than the other champions on this list. LeBlanc is 85% Luden's Tempest, which totally makes sense because she wants the mana for wave clear and she also wants the upfront burst damage. And Nidalee with Night Harvester, she wants the upfront burst damage and doesn't need the mana. So it kind of makes sense why these champions are building the items they do. Not sure what Riot can do to fix it, but it does look like it may be some tweaking needed in the item system to get more champions, especially to build Everfrost, as I do feel like that is a viable option on a lot of them that just isn't being built. Next up is Mage, which has added 4 champions to that list before, so now they're up to 10 misses from 6. Karthus building Liandry's Anguish, that doesn't surprise me at all. Honestly, I was surprised he wasn't a champion flagged for being a Liandry's Anguish abuser on the previous post, so this actually totally makes sense. Like I said, Liandry's Anguish is just so hard to justify going anything else on champions that can build it in the first place. Taliyah being at 75% on the Luden's Tempest kind of surprises me, but not really. I think she can use a Liandry's Anguish if she is going for more of a kite back sort of build against multiple frontliners, and she needs to be able to shoot through those health bars, but I'm not surprised she goes Luden's Tempest because of it synergizing with her ability to stay in the fight, get more Qs onto you, and also the upfront burst damage, because Taliyah is more of a bursty champion nowadays following her release and subsequent balancing into a sort of burst jungler. Twisted Fate is at 75% on Hextech Rocket Belt, and Veigar is at 75% on Luden's Tempest, which both of those kind of surprise me a little bit. I do feel like TF can get value out of Luden's Tempest to sort of help him kite back and get a little bit more damage right off the bat, especially when he does something like teleport in with a gold card, Luden's Tempest proc, Lichbane proc, maybe even you've got the Fire Cannon crit on top of that and just sort of insta-give someone. So it does surprise me that he's got Rocket Belt at 75%, but it does kind of make sense since he is a relatively immobile champion who can use that to close the gap, do silly things like Rocket Belt into gold card. So yeah, okay, it kind of makes sense to me. and Vhagar with the Luden's Tempest. Again, I feel like he can go some other options as well, but Tempest is definitely sort of the default item I feel like a lot of champions buy, and we'll kind of see if Everfrost can't do something to help Vhagar, as I do think that helps account for his problems with enemy champions getting on top of him, doing silly things like Everfrost into a Dark Matter on top of you. And these champions are both fairly low, so they are using other options. They're not exclusively building Rocket Belt and Tempest, respectively. So we'll kind of have to see as things continue down the line if they will be building those items more and more. Moving on to fighters who have gone up to 12 misses now. I believe there were 5 or 6 champions added after the number rectification. Darius and Garen, I actually mentioned in the previous video because Riot talked about them, and I was like, these guys totally didn't violate. They were under the 75%. What gives? Well, now with the appropriate numbers, they're up to 86% and 83% respectively on Stridebreaker, which just makes sense. These champions want to be able to stick to you for longer in order to get either more hemorrhage stacks on you or more ticks of judgment. So it kind of makes sense why they're spamming Stridebreaker to the exclusion of all else. I feel like a part of the problem is because of how niche Trinity Force is nowadays. A lot of these champions don't really need the scaling attack speed that Trinity Force gives you. Garen can kind of sort of justify it, but not really, especially given that Stridebreaker helps him solve one of the biggest problems he has as a champion, which is his limited mobility. So I don't know how you get these champions not hardbound to these items without either buffing up all of their alternatives to ludicrous levels and maybe breaking a bunch of other champions at the same time, or otherwise looking at ways to make it so Stridebreaker has more competition. Nasus has an 81% hardbind ratio to Divine Sunder, which totally makes sense. He is a Sheen champion. Pantheon is actually at 76% on Eclipse, which kind of surprises me. I know he can go things like Gore Drinker if he really wants to be more of a frontline-y, sustain-y fighter, but generally speaking, I feel like the situations in which you want to build Gore Drinker on Pantheon are few and far between, and it does make sense to go Eclipse, and especially given that he goes top lane most often, I feel like there isn't really opportunities for him to go something like Prowler's Claw, where he doesn't really like the passive, or Duskblade, where he's not really a reset fighter, so you're definitely never going to see him go that. So yeah, it kind of makes sense why he'd go Eclipse and not a more fighter item. Renekton has also exceeded, and Riven as well. These are both champions who are bound to Gore Drinker. Again, it makes sense. These champions really want the sustain. They really want the ability to get a little bit of extra damage into their combo, so kind of makes sense why they're spamming those. And Udyr at 83% on Turbo Chem Tank. Totally makes sense. That's kind of the biggest flaw Udyr has, and he's actually someone who really enjoys the bonus that Chem Tank gives him. Moving on to tanks, which had 0 misses in the previous numbers, and now they have 6 misses. There are 3 supports here, Braum, Leona, and Thresh, who are all abusing Locket of the Iron Solari. I'm a little surprised that Leona is on this list as well. I do feel like she can maybe synergize with some of the other options. But generally speaking, Thresh and Braum make sense because Locket is a very defensive item, and they are very defensive supports that can help keep their allies alive for a little bit longer, so that does make sense. Amumu is bound to Sunfire Aegis. I don't really know how you get him off of that. I feel like the other tank options aren't enough to contest with just how hard he synergizes with Sunfire Aegis. This is sort of a one-off. I feel like most other tanks do have options in this regard, but Amumu just gets so much value out of Sunfire. I don't know how you get him to stop building it to the exclusion of all else without nerfing it specifically for him. We also then have Rammus and Skarner, who are hardbound to Turbo Chem Tank. Again, it sort of makes sense for these champions. They are the run at you and CCU champs, and they really synergize well with movement speed, so of course that's what's going to happen. Finally, in supports, we added 3 additional supports who are all Moonstone Renewer abusers in the forms of Ivern, Lulu, and Soraka. Now, these all slightly surprise me. I feel like these are all still champions that can abuse Mandate if they want to, due to the amount of poke that they can put out in lane, or Ivern being able to walk in a lane for a gank with Mandate, get a bunch of procs, and get a bunch of bonus damage on top of whatever his laner is already doing. But the biggest thing here, I think, is that because you can't proc Mandate on your own, Ivern, especially as a sort of independent champion, really feels bad about building that item and definitely wants to go the Moonstone Renewer and doesn't get a lot of value out of the other mythic passives. And Lulu and Soraka, I feel like they can still go Mandate and probably do, but I think a lot of people have been clued in by now that Moonstone Renewer is really good, and until it gets nerfed a little bit harder, I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see those champions be hard-bound. Either way, that's all of that, so glad we finally got the appropriate numbers and a little bit more to talk about on that regard. So if you guys do watch the old video, you guys completely disregard that. Don't completely disregard it. I do talk about some of the other champions that are on the list, but definitely this video is going to provide more of an update look. Finally, for today, Riot Scruffy also posted an interesting change list here for Xin Zhao, where Riot are trying to highlight the unique ranged gameplay he has with his W2 and fit it into his build a little bit better, and also open up or reinvigorate new off builds for Xin Zhao with meaningfully different gameplay outputs. So bringing back things like Crit Zhao or AP Zhao in order to let him build slightly differently and do slightly different things. And while these numbers initially look like a nerf, I'm not going to read off the whole change list here, guys. You guys will be able to check that out. I'll have it linked down in the description. These numbers do look like a big nerf to Xin Zhao, especially as you're reading through it, but especially what I want to highlight here is the things he's gaining. I think the Win Before Lightning change, where his W2 challenges champions and monsters and provides vision of the target for 3 seconds when it lands. And then his Audacious Charge's cast range is increased to 1100 on challenged targets. What this means is that Xin Zhao can now walk in a lane and has multiple different ways of proceeding. He can either walk at you in order to try and get in range for the Audacious Charge into his normal combo. He can also go for the W2 in order to hit you with that first, get the slow, and then dash onto you with the Audacious Charge from an increased range. Or he can just walk at you as before and sort of see if he can't get in range for the auto attack, because if he's able to do so and then you dash or flash away, he has an increased range on Audacious Charge to chase you down. So it really provides him with more strategic insight and different ways of setting up engagements and setting up ganks, which I do really like, and I do feel like a lot of the sort of small nerfs he received to his passive and Q are sort of compensating for that particular change. The other thing is Crescent Guard has an ability power ratio, mostly irrelevant if you're not planning on building him AP, but the duration is now 5 seconds flat. It can't be extended by basic attacks and spells, but 5 seconds is a big deal on this ability. It always felt very short. Even if you were in the middle of combat constantly attacking people, it just didn't feel like it lasted very long. Getting a guaranteed 5 seconds out of the ability will also mean that Riot, because it's less malleable and it's harder to evaluate it based on a worst case and best case scenario because of the duration extending, how good you are at doing that. Now that's a flat value. It will also have options for Riot to buff it in the future if Xin Zhao does end up being too weak. The other thing to highlight here is the Win Before Lightning applying lifesteal at full effectiveness rather than 33% effectiveness, which is a huge deal, and the range increased as well. Yes, it did lose some small amount of base damage, but Xin Zhao is basically paying for all of this new utility he gained in his kit with some damage. So if you guys do check that out and you're like, oh my god, Riot, why are you nerfing Xin Zhao? I don't really think it's a nerf. I think it's more of a rebalancing, so please do keep that in mind. And that's going to be it for me today, guys. Thank you all so very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video today, and I hope you found some insight in what we talked about, especially from the post that Riot Scruffy put out. I always do enjoy looking at what he has to say, because I think there's a lot of useful information to be had there. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it. And I'll talk to you all later.